Hello, my dearest ones. How are you this night? I am the Night Lady, and tonight I brought you 5 friends for Latin America to tell you about the legends from there. Well, we'll have La Llorona from Mexico, El Chupacabra from Puerto Rico, PIUCHEN from Chile, PISHTACO from Bolivia, and PERERE from Brazil. I hope you enjoy and have amazing nightmares.
Hello, Night Lady. My name is Arturo. I'm 38 years old, and today I want to share a story that I've never been able to get out of my mind. As time goes by, what I saw and felt that night, when I was just 8 years old, still haunts me. I've tried to convince myself that it was only a dream or a child's imagination, but I can't forget. To this day, I know what I saw. I saw La Llorona. Back then, we lived in a small, almost isolated town surrounded by fields and rivers, where the nights were dark and quiet. My house was close to a river, and my grandmother, who passed away about 10 years ago, would always tell me stories about the hauntings around those waters. She was a serious woman, someone who believed deeply in the supernatural and respected it. My parents often laughed off her stories, but I listened, especially when she gave me warnings about the river. Never go there at night, Eduardo, especially not alone, she'd say. There are things in those waters that we don't understand, but they understand us all too well. My grandmother had a way of speaking that made it clear. She believed every word. She said that when she was young, she had seen strange things near the river, things she couldn't explain. She spoke of a woman who wandered by the riverbanks, crying out and calling for something that seemed forever lost. I never took it seriously, but now, thinking back, I know she was talking about La Llorona. In my heart, I know she had seen her too, and perhaps that's why her words were filled with such fear. One hot summer night, when I was 8, I remember everyone was already asleep. The house was silent, and the open windows let in the warm air, carrying the smell of earth and water. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, but the silence was so heavy that it felt almost suffocating. I was on the verge of falling asleep when I started hearing a strange sound, a cry. Soft, almost like a whisper, and it seemed far away. But something about it made my skin crawl. I curled up in bed, trying to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the crying continued, soft and constant, filled with a sadness so deep it was unlike anything I'd ever heard. That woman's voice was full of pain and regret. Something a child like me couldn't understand, but that frightened me deeply. Curious and terrified at the same time, I got up slowly and went to the window. The street was empty, the trees motionless, as if time itself had stopped. Then, I saw a figure in the distance, near the river. It was hard to see clearly in the dark, but I could make out the shape of a woman. She was standing still, and her presence was like a shadow darker than the night around her. She wore a long white dress that seemed to float around her, and her long, black, tangled hair fell over her face, hiding her eyes. My heart was beating so hard I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, but something kept me rooted in place, as if that figure had hypnotized me. And then, her crying grew louder, a lament so deep it seemed to carry the weight of an eternity of suffering. I didn't know what it was, but something inside me knew I was facing something supernatural. Her face was partially hidden by her hair, but in one swift motion, she pushed it aside, and I saw her. I saw her face, or rather, the emptiness where her eyes should have been. They were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull in the light and trap me in an endless abyss. Then her mouth opened, and she let out a scream that ripped through the night. A sound so intense and full of despair that I nearly fainted. At that moment, as if freed from a spell, I managed to move. I ran back to my bed, burying myself under the covers and trembling, praying for it all to go away. I could still hear the crying fading into the distance, but I knew she had seen me, and I knew that one day she would come back. I stayed awake until dawn, unable to close my eyes, and when morning finally came, I told my parents everything. They didn't believe me, of course. My father laughed, saying it was just a bad dream, but my mother stayed silent, thoughtful. Maybe she remembered how my grandmother had spoken of a figure crying by the river. I still remember my mother's look that day, as if, on some level, she did believe me but was too afraid to admit it. My grandmother, who was already fragile at the time, seemed to understand exactly what I was feeling. When I told her what I had seen, she looked at me with a mix of pity and worry. She placed her hand on my shoulder and said, with that firm voice of hers, "Now you've seen what I saw, Eduardo. La Llorona. She cries for what she lost, and she will keep crying until the end of time. Pray she never comes for you." Years passed, my grandmother passed away, and I moved away from that town, but her words have never left my mind. Neither has the sound of La Llorona's cry, on very quiet nights. Sometimes I feel like I can still hear that cry, coming from somewhere far, far away, like a whisper carried on the wind. And when I hear something that resembles it, my body reacts as it did that night. My heart races, my muscles tense, and for a moment I am that child again, standing at the window, looking into that empty face and hearing that mournful cry. With each passing year, I feel her presence closer, as if she's still waiting for me, as if she's never forgotten me. Every time I hear a similar sound, even if it's just the wind or the call of some animal, I avoid looking outside, afraid of seeing her there, on the other side of the window, waiting for me. Now, nearing 40, I carry this memory like a shadow that never fades. I know that if one day I hear that cry again, I may not be as lucky as I was when I was a child. La Llorona always returns to those who have seen her, and I fear that one day she will finally come to take me.
Hello, Night Lady. My name is Javier. I'm 26 years old, and I'm from Puerto Rico. Today, I want to share a story that still gives me chills just thinking about it. Something I never imagined could happen in real life. This story involves my son, Emiliano, my best friend Roman, and a creature I once thought existed only in legends, the Chupacabra. It was a moonless night, and Roman and I had decided to take Emiliano, my 5-year-old son, on his first hunting trip. We wanted him to experience nature, away from the lights of the city, and this seemed like the perfect night. We were camping in an isolated area of the forest, where the sound of insects and the rustling of leaves were our only companions. Roman, a skilled and experienced shooter, was with us, ready for any emergency. Emiliano was excited and curious, fascinated by everything around him. We decided to take a short walk through the forest at night to show him a bit more of that environment. We had our guns with us to ensure our safety, though it was meant to be just a symbolic experience. Roman and I were telling stories and making jokes to keep Emiliano comfortable and unafraid as he walked by my side, holding my hand tightly. But at one point, Emiliano let go of my hand and ran a bit ahead, laughing and hiding behind a tree. He always loved playing hide and seek, and Roman and I thought it was just more of his usual mischief. We called for him, but he didn't answer. We laughed at first, thinking he was just making us wait. But after a few minutes, he still hadn't appeared. A wave of worry started to rise within me. We called again, louder, but only silence answered us. Roman looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was the same thing I felt. A growing fear and a sense that something was very wrong. We decided to split up to search for him. Roman went towards the creek while I followed a small path that disappeared into the darkness. I illuminated every corner with my flashlight, calling out Emiliano's name with each step, feeling my heart pounding louder and faster. Then I heard a scream. Roman's desperate scream echoed through the forest, and I ran in his direction, flashlight shaking in my hand, my fear mounting with each step. When I finally reached him, I saw Roman standing there, frozen, gripping his gun tightly. His flashlight illuminated a scene that seemed straight out of a nightmare. In the middle of the trees, in a small clearing, I saw what he was pointing at. There was a creature hunched over, with dark, spiny skin, and eyes as black as bottomless pits. In its claws, it held Emiliano, who hung limp and motionless, as if he were a rag doll. For a moment, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet, and a primal fear took hold of me. It was the chupacabra, the creature so many had sworn to see in the shadows of Puerto Rico. And now it was right in front of us, with my son in its grasp. Roman, with the calm and precision he always had, raised his gun and aimed, his eyes focused and determined. He knew that any mistake could hit Emiliano, but he didn't hesitate. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, as if sensing the danger. Without wasting time, Roman fired, a perfect shot that hit the creature in the shoulder, forcing it to release Emiliano without harming him. The creature let out a piercing scream, a mix of anger and pain, and took a few steps back. I seized the moment and ran to grab my son, pulling him away while Roman kept his gun aimed, ready for any movement. Emiliano was trembling, in shock but alive. He looked at me with terrified eyes, clinging to me with all his strength, as if he understood that this was something far more serious than any game. He knew he had just escaped something horrible. The creature watched us with those hollow, empty eyes, filled with hate and hunger. Roman fired another shot, and this time it let out another scream before retreating into the shadows of the forest, leaving behind only the echo of its cry and the eerie silence of the night. I held Emiliano tightly in my arms, feeling his small, fragile body still shaking. Roman, breathless, came closer, and together we made our way back to the campsite as quickly as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders, afraid that thing might come back. Emiliano was silent, but he knew. He understood the real danger he had just faced. This was not a fleeting scare. It was the kind of terror that leaves scars. When we finally reached the campsite, Roman and I exchanged a look, still on high alert. That night, we didn't sleep. Emiliano stayed between us, still haunted and holding my hand tightly. We knew that nothing would ever be the same after that. That creature's presence wasn't just a legend, not a mere story. It was real, and we had barely escaped. Since that night, Emiliano has never been the same. His once curious, innocent gaze now holds a shadow of fear. And as for me, I still see that creature's eyes every time I close my own. I never thought a horror story would become my reality. Now, when the wind blows and the nights grow too quiet, I feel a chill down my spine, knowing it's still out there, lurking. And I know I'll never forget that night.
Hello, Night Lady. My name is Rosa. I'm 68 years old, and I live in a small, remote village in the Chilean countryside. Here, everyone knows me as a woman of faith, someone who is dedicated to prayer and our cultural traditions. Since I was young, I've understood that there are things in this world beyond what we can see or understand, dark, invisible forces that challenge our courage and test our faith. One of these forces is the PIUCHEN. I've always believed in the existence of the PIUCHEN. I grew up hearing stories about this terrifying creature, a mix of serpent and vampire, lurking in the shadows, feeding on the blood of animals and even people. My grandfather, a man who understood the mysteries of the forest, would say that the PIUCHEN preys on the weak and is drawn to those with vulnerable spirits. I remember the way he spoke about this creature with deep respect and fear. And even without having seen it myself, I knew the PIUCHEN was no mere legend. From a young age, my mother taught me the importance of faith. She believed that faith was our best protection against dark forces, and she would tell me to never, ever stop praying. Prayer is like a flame, my child, she would say, and dark creatures fear that light. Her words stayed with me, and it was thanks to her teachings that years later, I was able to survive my encounter with the PIUCHEN. It happened when I was 18 years old. Back then, our village was even more isolated than it is today, and the nights felt much darker. We didn't have electricity, and the only light came from candles and lanterns which cast dancing shadows on the walls and made the darkness seem even more alive. That night, I was alone at home. My mother had gone to visit a sick neighbor, and the rest of the family was working in the fields. The silence was deep, and I felt uneasy, as if something was wrong. As the night went on, I started hearing strange sounds outside. It was a hissing sound, like that of a giant snake slithering across the ground. But there was something more to it, a sense of menace that seemed to seep through the walls and reach my soul. I remembered my grandfather's warnings and what my mother always said about the PIUCHEN. My heart began to race, and I knew I was not alone that night. Terrified, I moved slowly to the door and peeked outside. The moonlight was faint, but I could make out a long, almost crawling figure moving through the yard. It was the PIUCHEN, without a doubt. It looked like a large serpent, but its skin was dark and shiny, as if covered in oil. But its eyes were what terrified me the most. They seemed human, yet filled with malice and hunger. It was staring at me, and I knew it had come to feed. I felt such a profound fear that my legs almost gave out. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to look away from that evil creature. But then, something within me ignited. I remembered my mother's words, and that faith was my only defense against the PIUCHEN. With tremendous effort, I raised my hands and began to pray, my voice trembling at first, but becoming steadier as the sacred words filled the air. I recited the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary over and over, with an intensity one had never felt before. It felt as though each word was a barrier of light rising around me, protecting me from harm. With every prayer, I felt my strength growing, and the fear started to give way to a confidence I didn't know I had. I kept my gaze fixed on the PIUCHEN, and I could see it beginning to hesitate, as if my faith was repelling it. The creature made a strange sound, almost like a groan, and pulled back slightly. I realized it was weakening, that my prayers were actually working. I continued to pray with even more fervor, invoking divine power to drive that thing away. And then I saw something incredible. The PIUCHEN began to writhe as if it were being burned and retreated further until it vanished into the shadows of the forest. When it finally disappeared, I fell to my knees, exhausted but feeling a deep peace. I knew I had been protected, that my faith and prayers had saved me. Since that night, I've never seen the PIUCHEN again, but its presence remains vivid in my memory, as if it had happened just yesterday. My neighbors learned of what happened, and ever since, they've called me a healer, someone capable of repelling evil through the power of faith. Over time, my reputation as a healer spread. People would come to me to pray for their families, to bless their homes, and they always said my faith was my greatest strength. I tell them that the protection comes from God, but it requires true belief, a pure faith, to drive away darkness. Today, when my grandchildren come to visit, they always ask me to tell the story of the PIUCHEN. They love hearing about that night, and I take the opportunity to teach them about the importance of prayer and faith. I tell them that the PIUCHEN is real and that it preys on those with weak spirits. I share this story not to scare them, but to teach them to respect the invisible forces of this world. Faith can drive away the darkness, but only if it is true. My grandchildren listen intently, and I see in their eyes the same curiosity and fear that I had at their age. And deep down, I pray they never have to face what I faced, but if they ever do, I want them to know that faith is the best defense against the shadows. That's my story, Night Lady. And every time I look at the trees surrounding my home, I remember the PIUCHEN's gaze, that moment when my faith was tested. May God protect my grandchildren and all those who, like me, live in this world full of mysteries and unseen dangers.
Hello, night lady. My name is Hector. I'm 42 years old, and I'm from Bolivia. Here, in the mountains and villages of my country, everyone knows the legend of the Pishtako. My mother told me about this creature since I was a child. The Pishtako, she said, looked like a man but had an empty gaze and pale skin that glowed under the moonlight. He wore a hat and a dark cloak that helped him disappear into the night. But the most terrifying part was that he hunted at night, in the shadows, feeding on the fat of people, especially those who walked alone on the roads. Although many people thought it was just a story to scare children, I always believed it. And one night, years ago, I learned in the worst way possible that the Pishtako is very real. I was 15 at the time, and like any teenager, I liked to test the limits my parents imposed on me. My mother was very religious and constantly warned me about the dangers of the night. She would say that the Pishtako roamed our village, searching for young, strong people like me. When she spoke of him, she would make the sign of the cross and look at me with a worried, almost pleading gaze. I listened, but I wanted to believe it was just a legend, a way to keep us safe at home. But that night, my curiosity and my urge to challenge my fears took over. It was a moonless night, and the wind blew strong, howling between the trees and houses. One of my cousins was celebrating her birthday, and some of my cousins and I had planned to meet in a field outside town, near the mountains, where we would often gather around a bonfire and tell stories. My mother, of course, forbade me to go. "Don't go out alone at night, Hector," she said. "It's dangerous." The Pishtako hunts on dark nights like this one. Despite her warning, as soon as everyone went to sleep, I slipped out the back door, careful not to make any noise. On the way, I met up with my cousins, who had also snuck out of their homes for our little nighttime adventure. There were 4 of us in total, me, Juan, Manuel, and Valentina. We felt the rush of adrenaline, and maybe, deep down, a little fear, but none of us would admit it. When we reached the field, the night was completely silent. Only the sound of the wind and rustling leaves filled the air. We started a small fire, and Juan, the oldest, began to tell the same stories we always heard about spirits and monsters in the mountains. We laughed and pretended to be brave, but with each story, the fear grew tighter in our chests. Suddenly, Valentina, the youngest, suggested we talk about the Pishtako. At that moment, we all fell silent. Juan gave a nervous smile, but accepted the challenge. "They say the Pishtako isn't fully human," he began. "That he's a creature of the shadows, feeding on people's fat to sustain his own life. He silently stalks his victims, only attacking when they're alone or unprotected." Suddenly, we heard a noise in the trees behind us. We froze, holding our breath, looking at each other and trying to figure out if one of us had made that sound. Juan, trying to stay calm, suggested it was just an animal. But when the noise grew louder and closer, we all stood up in panic. Valentina grabbed my arm tightly, and I could feel her hands shaking. "We should go back home," I whispered, feeling my heart racing. But before we could move, we saw a shadow moving between the trees. It was tall and appeared to be covered by a dark cloak. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I noticed a strange glow, almost as if its skin was too pale, reflecting the faint light that was there. "Run," Juan whispered, but fear seemed to have paralyzed us. The figure started to move closer, and I finally saw its face. Its eyes were empty, expressionless, but there was something deadly in them, a silent evil that made me want to scream. It was watching us as if it already knew we were its prey. And that's when I realized it was the Pishtako. There was no doubt. It took a step forward, and Manuel was the first to move, grabbing Valentina and yelling for everyone to run. Adrenaline took over, and we started running across the dark field, not knowing where we were going, just trying to escape that terrifying presence. I could hear the heavy footsteps of the Pishtako behind us, and the sound was like a nightmare coming to life. We ran as fast as we could, but the sound of the Pishtako's footsteps didn't fade. It was as if he was always just a few feet away, chasing us relentlessly. Valentina tripped and fell, and I stopped to help her, but panic had taken over us. Juan and Manuel pulled us up and forced us to keep going. Our lungs burned, and my legs felt heavy, but fear was stronger than the exhaustion. Finally, we saw the village in the distance, and that gave us renewed hope. But when I looked back, I saw that the Pishtako was still following us, closer than ever. His dark cloak seemed to blend with the darkness, and his eyes still glowed, fixed on us. He wouldn't give up easily, and in that moment, I realized he wanted more than just to scare us. When we finally reached the edge of the village, the figure stopped. He watched us from a distance, and for a moment, I thought he would continue to follow us. But then, he disappeared into the shadows, as if he had never been there. We stood there, trying to catch our breath, and looked at each other in silence, with no words for what we had just experienced. We returned home in complete silence. I knew my mother would be furious that I had gone out, but at the same time, I felt it wasn't the right time to tell her what had happened. That night, I had nightmares about the Pishtako, with his cold, empty eyes staring at me, waiting for the right moment to attack. The next morning, my mother looked into my eyes and sensed something was wrong. She hugged me and prayed in silence, perhaps feeling that her warning had been truer than any of us realized. I never went out alone at night again, and to this day, whenever I tell this story, my cousins confirm every detail. For us, there's no doubt the Pishtako is real. And that night, we were lucky to escape. Today, I tell this story to my children and nieces and nephews, hoping they understand that there are things in the night that shouldn't be challenged. The Pishtako still roams the shadows, and I pray none of them ever have to go through the terror we faced that night.
Hello, Night Lady. My name is Mariana, and today I want to share something you might find hard to believe. I never thought I'd experience anything like this. It was a hot, sticky night in the countryside of Minas Gerais, Brazil. I was at my grandmother's house, deep in the rural landscape, where the only sounds at night were the crickets and an occasional owl. My grandmother was a woman full of tales, many of which she insisted were true. One of her favorite stories was about the SACI PERERE. I used to laugh as a child, thinking it was just folklore. But that night, I realized it was more than just a story. It all started when I went to the shed to grab some firewood for a bonfire we were setting up in the backyard. It was a short walk, but it led through the darkest part of the yard, where the trees grew so thick their branches seemed to form walls. As I stepped onto that path, I felt a shift in the air, like something unseen was watching. The soft breeze that had been blowing through the trees suddenly stopped, as if the whole world were holding its breath. In that silence, I heard a whistle, faint, taunting, and seemingly coming from all directions. My heart started pounding. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just an animal or some echo from the forest. But the whistle didn't stop. It was persistent, teasing, like something was playing with me. And then I saw him. In the clearing ahead, a small figure with just one leg, hopping around and chuckling quietly. His gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. He wore a red cap that glowed faintly in the moonlight, and there was something both childlike and sinister in the way he moved. There was no mistaking it. This was the SACI PERERE, the very spirit my grandmother had warned me about. My body froze as I realized I was staring directly at him. I didn't know if I should run or try to face him. He seemed to enjoy my hesitation, bouncing in small, playful circles, his movements fluid and graceful. My heart was pounding so loudly, I could almost hear it in the silence. He whistled again, a sharp, mocking sound that made the air feel even thicker. I felt a sense of dread building as I realized I was alone, far from the house, and completely at his mercy. I remembered something my grandmother had told me once. If I ever came across the SACI, I should show no fear. It was easy to say, but standing there, face to face with him, was different. Trying to calm myself, I whispered, "I know you're there, and I'm not afraid of you." The SACI paused, tilting his head, looking almost surprised. I thought I saw a sly smile cross his face, and then he chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. He started hopping in circles around me, his movements quick and unpredictable. The smell of smoke filled the air, faint but unmistakable, as if something nearby was burning. My whole body was tense. I knew running wouldn't work, but I didn't know how to handle him either. Then he began to whisper. His voice was low and rough, like dry leaves brushing together. I couldn't make out the words. They sounded ancient, foreign. I felt like he was mocking me, saying I didn't belong here, that this was his forest. Fear started to cloud my thoughts, but then I remembered something else my grandmother had said. The SACI loves a challenge. Taking a deep breath, I said, "If you're so clever, why don't we make a bet?" His movements stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing with interest. He looked at me with a glint of amusement, as if I'd just offered him the best entertainment of his life. He whistled again, a sound filled with curiosity and excitement. "If I catch you, you'll leave me alone. But if you escape, I promise I'll never come back here." The SACI's eyes gleamed with mischief, and in a flash, he vanished into the shadows of the trees. But his whistle lingered, echoing through the forest, leading me deeper into the darkness. Without thinking, I followed, caught in a strange mix of fear and determination. The whistle seemed to dance around me, sometimes near, sometimes distant. The deeper I went, the colder the night became, and the ground felt soft, like it wanted to pull me in. Minutes felt like hours as I chased the faint red flash of his cap, always glimpsing it, never close enough to catch him. I lunged forward, reaching to grab him, but he slipped away, laughing softly, his voice echoing in the trees. He was toying with me, testing my patience and limits. Each failed attempt made me more frustrated and more afraid. It was as if he were leading me into his world, a place where I'd never find a way out of. Finally, exhausted, I stopped, realizing I was completely lost. The trees around me were twisted, their branches casting eerie shadows. I was out of breath, and the whistle had gone silent. Silence fell over the forest like a blanket, thick and heavy. The darkness was overwhelming, pressing in, and I could barely see my hand in front of me. Panic welled up inside, and I shouted for help, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the night. Then, I felt something cold brush my shoulder. I turned, and for a brief second, I saw him again, standing close enough that I could see every detail of his face, the mocking smile, those eyes that held secrets as old as the earth, and that unmistakable red cap. He chuckled one last time, then vanished, leaving only a faint trace of his whistle, fading away until there was nothing but silence. When I finally stumbled back to my grandmother's house, I was exhausted, my mind reeling. She was waiting on the porch, a knowing look on her face. She didn't say anything, just nodded as if she understood. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "Now you know, don't you? Some things aren't meant to be understood, only respected." Since that night, I've never doubted her stories again. And whenever I hear a whistle in the distance, I lock my doors and windows, reminding myself that while the SACI loves his games, he doesn't appreciate intruders in his territory.
So, my dears, those were the stories of the night. I would like to know if you have any personal stories to send me. The email address is in the descriptions. And remember, you are